Okay, here we go. This is session number 52. All right, moving right along. We are still in chapter 7, called The Gifts of the Kingdom. This will be section number 8. All right, Roman numeral VIII. All right, section number 8 on page 129, entitled The Unbelievable Belief. All right, so Jesus is going to be talking about the ego thought system, the belief, all right, the thought system that arises when I believe I can separate from the oneness, from the totality of the kingdom, right? As they say, into the mind there arose a tiny mad idea, right? And this is the tiny mad idea, that I could be separate from my source. I could leave the mind of God. I could be separate from the totality of things, right? That's what they call the tiny mad idea. So into the mind arose the tiny mad idea, and it says, at which the Son of God remembered not to laugh. All right? And then took it seriously, and believing that it could have serious consequences. And we were off to the races, because the mind is a very powerful thing. All right, the mind is that powerful. It thought it could separate. Right? And so it believed it. All right, and here we are trying to undo that. All right? And Jesus reassures us throughout the text that it's already been undone. All right? Actually, everything's okay. You just don't realize it yet. Okay? You're still in the dream. Okay? So, Helen Schuckman, who is the scribe of the course, was, as Ken describes her, she's quite a cantankerous personality. Like in the beginning, she says to Jesus, Jesus says, this is a Course in Miracles, please take notes. And somewhere along the line, she says, well, is it a required course? Because she was, fully surrounded in academics. And, that was the question, is it a required course? So they play off that idea. All right, so then he says, you've already passed. There are no tests. That was another conversation they had. So it's the belief. It's that belief that we could separate from the mind of God, which in this section he's referring to as the unbelievable belief. Okay? So let's, without any further ado, all right, we'll go into section 8, the unbelievable belief. We have said that without projection, there can be no anger. But it is also true that without extension, there can be no love. These reflect a fundamental law of the mind, and therefore one that always operates. It is the law by which you create and were created. It is the law that unifies the kingdom and keeps it in the mind of God. To the ego, the law is perceived as a means of getting rid of something it doesn't want. To the Holy Spirit, it is the fundamental law of sharing, by which you give what you value in order to keep it in your mind. To the Holy Spirit, it is the law of extension. To the ego, it is the law of deprivation. It therefore produces abundance or scarcity, depending on how you choose to apply it. The choice is up to you, but it is not up to you to decide whether or not you utilize the law. Every mind must project or extend, because that is how it lives, and every mind is life. So he says, the only choice you have is how you choose to use this law of mind. All right? The mind is constantly beaming out. And we'll use the two words in the course. All right? It's either extending, all right? Extending love, extending abundance, extending all that is, the idea of totality. All right? Words are insufficient, but we use them in our condition here to try to describe the activity of the mind. And Jesus, in the beginning of this section, reminds us, this is how you were created. All right? The original source, God, right, extended, just extended, and it was you. It was you, and that's how you were created, and that's what you were created to do, to extend, just like your source, just like your Father, as we say in the course. All right? You create that way. But once we believe the unbelievable belief that we have separated, the ego tries to stay away from that remembrance of who you are, and it projects, it constantly projects. That's the word we'll use to describe the law of the mind, that constant beaming, but in the ego thought system, it becomes what we call projection. And thanks to Freud, we can explain it better. Okay, like he says here, the ego uses it. It's perceived as a means of getting rid of something it doesn't want. Okay, and what the mind doesn't want in the ego thought system is the guilt. Oh, I separated from the oneness. I destroyed the oneness. I destroyed heaven. I attacked God. Right? Those are all the silly thoughts at the beginning. All right? That arose immediately when the tiny mad idea arose that perhaps I could separate. Perhaps I could be an individual. All right? Automatically the mind splits and chooses the ego, and there it is. Automatically, there's guilt over having destroyed the oneness, all right? And in other words, having attacked God, all right? And then there's the fear of retaliation, all right? Oh, I did something, sin, right, resulting in guilt and fear. I did something. And that's what the ego does. It tries to get rid of something it doesn't want. So it just suggests, well, let's get out of the mind. So we project out of the mind, and all these things in form are created, miscreated, as Gloria would say, Ken's wife, Gloria. All right? And Jesus would say, you made them, okay? So we made the universe, all right? And so that was the initial act of getting rid of something we didn't want, which was the guilt, all right? We made up all these forms so that we could hide among the forms and, and then project onto those forms what I didn't want, which is the guilt, basically, okay? And it comes in many forms, all kinds of forms, all right? There's the sense of lack, all right, which is what he mentions here, all right, where he says that to the ego, this is the law of extension. We extend love. To the Holy Spirit, excuse me, all right? To the Holy Spirit, it's extension. We extend totality. We extend love, all right? And to the ego, it's the law of deprivation. We project the idea that something is lost, something's been done, something's missing, okay? So he says, so this power that the mind has, that it's always engaged in, it's either producing abundance or scarcity, all right? Depending on how you choose to apply it. He says the choice is up to you, but it's not up to you to decide whether or not you will utilize the law. You're always utilizing the law. Every mind must project or extend, because that is how it lives. And every mind is life, okay? I remember someone was asking Ken about channeling, okay? And Ken says, what do you make a big deal about it for? He says, you're always channeling, all right? And this is what this reminds me of. You're always using that power of the mind to beam outward, okay? He says, you're always channeling. He says, when you sit at the table for family dinner and you say, pass the salt, he says, you're channeling. So another way we could put that is that you're either projecting or extending, right? Depending on what part of the mind you're coming from, all right? Are you coming from the what we call the right mind, all right? The mind where the memory of who you are exists, all right? Are you in touch with that memory? And if so, that pass the salt will be coming from a place of extending love and abundance and safety and consistency and all those wonderful words. Or if you're in the ego's part of the mind, the wrong mind, all right, where there's constant fear, uncertainty, loneliness, fear, right? Conflict. There's always conflict. That pass the salt might have a little edginess to it, There might be the message, pass the salt. This food doesn't taste right, there's something wrong with it, which is now you're insulting the chef or the homemaker or whoever invited you in the first place, whoever was silly enough to invite you, all right? Okay, or it could be giving the message of, please help me, I need salt in my diet, whatever. You get the point, I hope. All right? No matter what you're doing, you're always beaming. As Ken would say, there's no neutral. All right? In this engine, there's no neutral gear. You're either in drive or in reverse. Okay? So, every mind must project or extend. And just remember, the ego utilizes it. Right? And so we'll go to paragraph 2. The ego's use of projection must be fully understood before the inevitable association between projection and anger can be finally undone. The ego always tries to preserve conflict. All right? It has to. That's what it thrives itself. It thrives on conflict. Okay? it is very ingenious in devising ways that seem to diminish conflict, because it does not want you to find conflict so intolerable that you will insist on giving it up. The ego, therefore, tries to persuade you that it can free you of conflict, lest you give the ego up and free yourself. Right? Using its own warped versions of the laws of God, the ego utilizes the power of the mind only to defeat the mind's real purpose. Right? It projects conflict from your mind to other minds in an attempt to persuade you that you have gotten rid of the problem. Okay? So it has very ingenious ways of diminishing conflict, like, treaties and let's sit down and talk about this, and, so you think you got rid of the problem, okay? Your co-workers, your significant others, even people that you meet in your daily activities, conflicts arise, and we can even take courses in conflict resolution, okay? And these things help on the level of form. But what it does is diminish. It diminishes the conflict. Never really gets rid of it. It's forgive and don't forget. Things like that. But the ego just wants to, like he says, the ego doesn't want you to become aware of how intolerable constant conflict is, because then you'll use the mind to defeat the ego. You'll go back to your right mind. You'll invite the memory of who you are. All right? This is the beginning of this Course in Miracles. That's how it began, with two people, Helen Schuckman and Bill Thetford, right? Two clinical psychologists, going off to a meeting of the psychology department and just tired of the conflicts, right? The bickering, the backstabbing, constant. And until Bill Thetford said, there has to be a better way. There has to be a better way to get on, to communicate. Right? And Helen Schuckman agreed. She said, yes. And she said, I'll help you find it. Okay? And that was the invitation to change the mind. Let's change our mind. All right? We can put all these salves and ointments and tonics and Band-Aids and everything on the conflict, and it seems to quiet down for a while. All right? But things always pop up again. Like they say, in every treaty is the seed of the next war or the next conflict. Okay? Because it only appeases that part of the mind. The ego doesn't want you to find the true answer. Okay? And the true answer, the elimination of all conflict, is going to that stately calm within, as they say, the right mind. Right? And letting peace arise in your mind. Right? And if you're still informed, there will be the true answers to conflict. All right? That you will be peaceful. Okay? The silliness, the outrageousness, the violence, the viciousness may still be going on around you in form, but you will have arrived at a place in the mind where you're peaceful. You understand where that's coming from, and you understand your part in it. Right? and there will be no fear. Right? There'll be no fear for you. Right? That comes with that entering that peaceful place. Right? But the ego doesn't want you to go there. Right? That's why it spends so much of its energy keeping you out of the mind, keeping you distracted. Okay? And like he says at the end of paragraph 2, it projects the conflict from your mind to other minds in an attempt to persuade you that you've gotten rid of the problem. All right? And you see, even if, say you have a friend who disappointed you, or even a friend that passed away, or a loved one passed away, or you just had an argument with someone that you love, and this, that, and the other, and you're carrying this around, all right? And there's all kinds of thoughts swirling around. It's almost like the ego now's got the periscope up and it's looking. How can I get rid of this horrible feeling that I have inside of me? All right? And it just, the ego consoles us, counsels us. Find the guilty part. Oh, there they are. And you do whatever you do to get rid of the conflict in yourself. You find the guilty party. They're doing something wrong. They're saying something wrong. All right? Look what they're doing. They're worse than me. And so you feel a little better. The ego tries to tell you, project the conflict onto someone else. All right? Just get rid of the feeling. You'll feel better. Okay? And it's just in my nature. All right? I always felt that I had a link to some kind of spiritual path. All right? But I always had another side, which was, a heightened awareness and a tendency to be bellicose, let's put it that way. All right? My friend Patty refers to me and herself as spiritual hooligans. All right? But there's always that Aries nature, that war nature, that tends to pull me away. All right? It pulls me away. So if I'm having a perceived problem, something's upsetting me in some way, I need to be vigilant for my tendency to go have an argument, with anybody, stranger, preferably, and then immediately feel horrible. I mean, that's how I experience it these days. If that happens like that, I'm immediately aware that I have given away my peace. All right, and I know the process by now. After so many years of studying this psychological spirituality, I know what process I'm going through. And I just realized that I don't have to spend too much time in that space, right? And being vigilant enough, you can catch yourself when you have moved into that bellicose state, right? That state that wants to project a conflict onto someone else instead of going to the right mind to resolve the conflict. And the process is the same for all the conflicts. To go to the right mind and ask your higher self, right? Ask that form of Jesus or Buddha, right? Or whatever wonderful guru you've been in touch with. You contact that image in your mind and you say, what's the truth here? What does peace look like? What does love look like? I want to see the situation correctly. All right? And so I can resolve it in my mind. resolve it through the process of taking back the projections. I don't want to project. And then I asked to see things correctly. That's the process of forgiveness that we'll go into detail in the book. And that's one of the main teachings of the Course in Miracles is forgiveness. And that's what it means by forgiveness. You realize, no, oh, wait, I don't want to project, right? After a while, you get tired of it, okay? That's why he says the ego likes to make you think, okay, everything's okay now, everything's cool, all right? Because it doesn't want you to get tired of the conflict. But sooner or later, you get to a point where you go, this has to end. I can't stand it anymore. So you get to the point where you don't want to project, all right? So where do you go? The second step is to go to that stately calm within, the right mind, right, where the memory of who you really are exists. And you present the case. Say, I want to see correctly, all right? As long as I'm still here in form, I want to interpret the form correctly, right? And as Jesus says, if you need a word, you'll get it. If you need to act on something, you'll have that idea of what the right thing to do is, all right? But you'll be coming from that place of peace, not from the urge to project the conflict onto someone else. All righty then. So, just to end off so we can pick up in the third paragraph, we'll end off at this sentence 6 in paragraph 2. It projects conflict from your mind to other minds in an attempt to persuade you that you have gotten rid of the problem. Okay? Now, paragraph 3. There are two major errors involved in this attempt. First, strictly speaking, conflict cannot be projected because it cannot be shared. Right? Any attempt to keep part of it and get rid of another part does not really mean anything. Remember that a conflicted teacher is a poor teacher and a poor learner. His lessons are confused, and their transfer value is limited by his confusion. The second error is that you can get rid of something you do not want by giving it away. That's the error. You think you can get rid of something you don't want by giving it away. Giving is how you keep it. All right? The belief that by seeing it outside you, you have excluded it from within, is a complete distortion of the power of extension. That is why those who project are vigilant for their own safety. They are afraid that their projections will return and hurt them. Believing they have blotted their projections from their own minds, they also believe their projections are trying to creep back in. Since the projections have not left their mind, they are focused to engage in constant activity in order not to recognize this. All right? So we're really getting into the psychology of it all, right? Excuse me. So he says you can't get rid of something partially. All right? Like you get rid of the conflict, even, you bring the conflict to a resolution even. You're still holding on to a part of it. Okay, so you can't just get rid of one part and keep another. All right? And then he goes, so you become a conflicted teacher and your lessons are a little confused, a lot confused, okay? And then the second error is that you can get rid of something you don't want by giving it away. But our mind it's how we were created, right? With God extending, all right? So that's what our mind does. It gives. And by giving, it's reinforced. It grows. So when we extend love, the love is reinforced. When we extend the idea of oneness, that awareness is reinforced in us. Right? So he says you can't get rid of conflict by giving it away. You're only reinforcing it. All right? And then he says, then the ego tries to keep you busy so you don't realize it. Right? You know, you have a big argument with somebody and, you know, next thing you know, you think you got your point across, you know? I got my point across. And then all of a sudden you get it out, well, let's engage in some activity, you know? Let's go have dinner, let's go have a drink, let's play darts, let's, you know, whatever your activity is, okay? So, I don't want to tell you too many of my old activities, okay? But playing darts was one of them. Okay, but the ego keeps you busy, you know? So you don't, you know, think about it too much, all right? And get tired of the conflict. Because you realize you didn't really get rid of the conflict, okay? So, I mean, you know, say you have an argument with your neighbor, and even you sit down and you think you came to a, excuse me, a conclusion. We're all settled. We're settled in now. But you know, next time you go out of your house to get in your car, you put out your garbage, whatever, you see your neighbor, there's always that little, something has changed in the relationship, you know? And there it is. You know, ego wants you to keep busy so you don't dwell on that. You don't decide, I need to see a better way. I'm tired of, you know, just projecting guilt onto my neighbor. All right? After a while you realize it's crazy and it doesn't work. It doesn't make you feel better. And then you're liable to go into your mind and say, help me to see this better. You know, ego doesn't want you to do that. So since the projections have not left their minds, they are forced to engage in constant activity in order not to recognize this. Paragraph 4, you cannot perpetuate an illusion about another without perpetuating it about yourself. Basically repeating what we said in the last session, okay? All right, just saying it in a different way. You can't perpetuate the illusion about the other. The other is guilty. All right, that's the illusion. All right, they did something. All right, there's something wrong with them. All right, he says you can't keep that up without perpetuating it about yourself. All right, if somebody else is guilty, that means the possibility of guilt exists and you're there. That's you. All right? And it goes on and on. He says you just can't perpetuate an illusion about another without perpetuating it about yourself. Sentence 2, there's no way out of this, right? Because it's impossible to fragment the mind. To fragment is to break into pieces, and mind cannot attack or be attacked. All right? You can't break the mind. All right? The belief that it can, an error the ego always makes, underlies its whole use of projection. It does not understand what mind is, and therefore does not understand what you are. Yet its existence is dependent on your mind, because the ego is your belief. The ego is my belief that I could separate from the mind of God. The ego is my belief that I could break off a little piece for myself. All right? So the ego is my belief. The ego doesn't know what I am. All right? The ego is that belief in separation. It's that belief in fragmentation. And so the ego is constantly separating and fragmenting. Right? It likes to keep people separate. And just, you notice all this fragmentation in your life, all the separation. Right? Even the groups that think they are spiritual and wonderful, right? They put walls up, mentally, physically, to keep out the others that don't think like them. They keep separating, all right? So the ego doesn't understand what mind is, and therefore does not understand what you are. Yet its existence is dependent on your mind, because the ego is your belief. The ego is a confusion in identification. Never having had consistent model, it never developed consistently. It is the product of the misapplication of the laws of God by distorted minds that are misusing their power. All right? So it's a misapplication of the laws of God, that extension of love. Okay? It becomes projection of guilt. All right? So it's a misapplication of the laws of God by distorted minds that are misusing their power. All right, the mind becomes distorted when you believe you could separate from your source, when you believe you could separate from the mind of God. All right? And so it's not, it doesn't have, the ego doesn't have a consistent model. Okay? And here's a big sentence. It's italicized in the book here, paragraph 5, because a lot of you probably will experience for yourself. All right. He says, "Do not be afraid of the ego." It's almost like I know in my early studies in the course, I would always think like the ego's going to retaliate. Oh, the ego's going to retaliate. Because it even has a sentence in the book that the ego becomes suspicious and then it becomes vicious. Right? So it's speaking as if it's an outside entity. All right? I mean, we can go so far as to think it's like the devil. It's like an evil spirit or something. Right? It's the product of our belief that I could be separated from God. That's what it is. All right? So he says, don't be afraid of it. Do not be afraid of the ego. It depends on your mind. And as you made it by believing in it, so you can dispel it by withdrawing belief from it. All right? I don't want it anymore. I don't want it. Help me to see correctly. And when we go to the right mind, we're reinforcing the right mind and all its effects. All right? And therefore we're withdrawing our belief from the ego. Right? We're believing more in who we really are. Right? So we're withdrawing our belief from it. Right? So do not project the responsibility for your belief in it onto anyone else, or you will preserve the belief. When you are willing to accept sole responsibility for the ego's existence, you will have laid aside all anger and all attack, because they come from an attempt to project responsibility for your own errors. Okay? But having accepted the errors as your own, do not keep them. Give them over quickly to the Holy Spirit to be undone completely, so that all their effects will vanish from your mind and from the sonship as a whole. Okay? This is how the process of forgiveness is going to be introduced and explained. All right? Jesus will say this again in a different place. He'll tell you to bring your projections back, but don't let them stay there. Don't let them rest on you. All right? Bring them to the Holy Spirit to be reinterpreted. How do I see correctly? All right? So he says, well, the first thing is that you got to accept the responsibility. I believe I could separate from God. That's how I got here. All right? And he says, don't punish yourself for that. Just realize that's what happens. All right? That's the silly, you put your belief in that silly idea. All right? So he says, don't project the responsibility for your belief into anyone else, or you will preserve the belief. All right? It's their fault. I didn't do it. All right? So you don't project the guilt, any kind of guilt, onto anyone else. All right? So he says, when you are willing to accept sole responsibility for the ego's existence, all right, you will have laid aside all anger and all attack, because they come from an attempt to project responsibility for your own errors. All right? So that's the process. That's the work we do. All right? To get out of form. All right? To be vigilant once again for when I'm in the ego, and just take responsibility for it. Oh, he made me angry, right? They scared me. I'm afraid of this, I'm afraid of that. Look, I have no control over that, But just take responsibility and say, oh, I'm listening to the ego again. I'm listening to the ego, right? And I don't want it, right? So, but he says, so having accepted the error as yours, by saying, oh yes, I'm listening to the ego. I've accepted it as my guide. I don't want it anymore. He says, but having accepted the errors of yours, do not keep them. All right? Don't let them stay there and say, oh, look what I did again. I've been studying this course for so long. Why do I do this? When am I going to learn? All that nonsense. That's letting it stay here. Just don't do that. Having accepted the errors as yours, do not keep them. All right? Give them over quickly to the Holy Spirit to be undone completely. All right? Okay. I'm listening to the ego. Holy Spirit, help me to see correctly. All right? I want you to be my guide. Jesus, I want you to be my guide. All right? Help me to see correctly. Help me to see the way you would. All right? And so he says, give them over quickly to the Holy Spirit to be undone completely, so that all their effects will vanish from your mind and from the sonship as a whole. Right? So all the effects of having chosen the ego thought system will leave your mind. Right? There'll be no little residuals, the way the ego resolves conflict. All right? We go to the right mind, we go to the Holy Spirit, the memory of who you are. We go to Jesus, the manifestation of that memory, all right, in form, all right? And Jesus is the goal we seek and the means of getting to that goal. So we ask, Holy Spirit, Jesus, help me to see this correctly, all right? So that all these things of the ego will be undone. And they'll vanish from your mind and the mind of the sonship as a whole, because the mind is one. All right? So, paragraph 6. The Holy Spirit will teach you to perceive beyond your belief, because truth is beyond belief, and his perception is true. The ego can be completely forgotten at any time, because it is totally incredible belief. It is a totally incredible belief. So the ego can be forgotten at any time, because it is a totally incredible belief. And no one can keep a belief that he has judged to be unbelievable. The more you learn about the ego, the more you realize that it cannot be believed. The incredible cannot be understood because it is unbelievable. The meaninglessness of perception based on the unbelievable is apparent, but it may not be recognized as being beyond belief because it is made by belief. So he says the meaninglessness of perception based on the unbelievable is apparent, okay? But it may not be recognized as being beyond belief, right? Because it is made by belief. So I believed I could be separate from God. So the unbelievable belief came into being. All these meaningless things came into being, all right? So what he's telling us here is that we need a little help, all right? All right, like the old basketball courts, you know? The ball would go rolling away, 20 yards away, and you, hey, a little help. So whoever's on the other courts would pick up the ball and throw it back. So that's what we do with the Holy Spirit and Jesus. We notice we've drifted into the ego, and we don't want that. And we look over at Jesus and say, hey, a little help, please. A little help. All right? And that's what we do. All right? Believe me, I'm not demeaning the process by saying things like that. We should look at it that way, as if Jesus is just another guy on the court, all right? It's just that he doesn't miss, really. So he's picked first. All right? But we go to him for help, all right? Because we believe we could separate from God. And that belief is strong, it's very strong, okay? So you have to keep going back to him and saying, please help me. Help me to see this correctly, all right? So let's just repeat that fifth sentence in paragraph 6. The meaninglessness of perception, all right, based on the unbelievable is apparent, but it may not be recognized as being beyond belief because it was made by belief, all right? So you may not recognize it as being meaningless and silly and illusory and things. You might not recognize it. So then, paragraph 7, all right, he says, the whole purpose of this course is to teach you that the ego is unbelievable and will forever be unbelievable. You who made the ego by believing the unbelievable cannot make this judgment alone. Okay? By accepting the atonement for yourself, you are deciding against the belief that you can be alone, thus dispelling the idea of separation and affirming your true identification with the whole kingdom as literally part of you. This identification is as beyond doubt as it is beyond belief. Your wholeness has no limits because being is infinity. Okay? Dwell on that for a second or two. All right? Your being is infinite. Right? There's no boundaries. There are no limits. It's hard to even conceive of limitlessness in our brains, right? In our mind. The mind can become aware of limitlessness. Okay? But he's telling us the whole purpose of this course is to teach you that the ego is unbelievable. Right? It's constantly shining on the ego, exposing it for its unbelievable nature. It's the unbelievable belief. Right? The unbelievable belief is that I could separate from my source. I could separate from the one mind. All right? That's the unbelievable belief. So he says, and you who made the ego by believing the unbelievable cannot make this judgment alone. All right? Because left to our own devices, we'll be using ego solutions for things. All right? So we just go to the mind, the higher mind, the spiritual mind. All right? And we ask, help me to see this correctly. I want my perception changed. The miracle. Okay? And that's the practice. That's the practice forever. Until you wake up. All right? And Jesus says you stay here and you may stay here in form for a little while. You know, but you'll be aware. You will be happy because you know where you're coming from and you know where you are. All right? And you will be certain. All right? You'll be certain of your place in infinity. All right? And that reminds me, in the last session, he spoke about patience. You'll be able to be patient with people, all right? And that patience comes from certainty, right? You'll be certain of what being is all about. And you'll be certain about their being. And you'll be able to see through the illusion. You'll be able to see through their disguises, that they truly believe, and you'll be able to be patient, all right? Because you know what they're going through, and you know who they truly are, all right? And you know that they will come to accepting who they truly are, all right? And he talks about, so we can't do this alone. Then he talks about by accepting the atonement for yourself. All right, that means you're accepting your own innocence. We're going to the right mind and ask him, how can I see this? Through the eyes of innocence. I mean, like we say, the words, they don't matter. You know, it's the desire in your mind, the desire to see correctly, the desire to experience peace. right? The desire to remember that you never separated from God. That's the atonement. So accepting the atonement for yourself, right? You are deciding against the belief that you can be alone, thus dispelling the idea of separation and affirming your true identification with the whole kingdom as literally a part of you. All right? This identification is beyond doubt and it is beyond belief. And your wholeness has no limits, right? Because being is infinity. All right, we strive to reach that awareness. All right, and one way we get to that awareness is by realizing that we're being guided by the ego. All right, I walk down the street and remind myself, oh, I have that tendency toward bellicosity, let's say, okay? And I don't want it. I know where it goes, all right? I've circled the sun enough times to realize where that goes, all right? And it never gets what I really want. Jesus always says, I know what you really want, all right? You want peace. You want peace of mind. And from that peace of mind will spring that awareness of your infinite being. All right. Dwell on that. All right. And we'll see you soon. Okay then. Thank you.